So our speaker for the session today is Gordon Dunsire, a real Kent face and respected metadata and digital libraries development expert. Currently, Gordon is Chair-elect and Philip Rep of the Joint Steering Committee for Development RDA. He's also a member of the British Library and Philip Committee on RDA and also works as part of the RDA outreach group. Some areas that Gordon is also expert within include obviously linked data, the semantic web, and just opening access to bibliographic data. So really, Gordon is going to give us a little bit of information or an introduction to RDA and what its effect will have on bibliographic data. He's going to talk about some of the benefits and drivers of RDAifying, I don't know if that's a word yet, RDAing your catalogue, and also an understanding of what RDA is and how it will affect staff and visitors to your library catalogues. And also a little bit about what your library catalogue will look like in the future. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Gordon.
Thank you, Penny, and good afternoon to everyone. As Penny has said, this is going to be a fairly brief and broad overview of the impact of RDA on libraries. Something that is now obviously happening operationally because of the adoption of RDA by various cataloguing agencies, including the British Library. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to RDA. And then discuss some of the impact it might have on library users. Then the impact on library management systems, and finally I will talk more generally about the environment within which RDA operates and develops, including relationships with other cataloging standards in the bibliographic metadata area. I should also say that there will be time for questions at the end of this presentation, and if you have any questions during the presentation, if you could put them into the chat channel, and we'll try and pick up on them at the end. Okay, RDA stands for Resource Description and Access. Its official title is in fact RDA : Resource Description and Access, thus providing an interesting RDA challenge for catalogers, since the acronym is part of the title proper. It's a new standard for creating bibliographic metadata. I'm using these words and bracketing the old way of speaking because I think things are moving away from traditional concepts of the catalogue record into much more modern ideas of distributed metadata. It's a new standard that's based on the AACR, Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, which itself has been in continuous development since 1841. That's a figure plucked out of thin air. It happens to be the publication date of Panizzi's Rules for the British Museum, and is generally acknowledged as the beginnings of modern cataloging. RDA builds on AACR, so it's reasonable to claim that it represents over 1.5 centuries of thinking in the modern world about cataloging and metadata. But RDA is also based on much more modern thinking, and specifically amongst those things are functional requirements for bibliographic records, FRBR, and other stuff like international cataloging principles and the successor standard to FRBR FRAD for authority data. Most of those standards have been in development since 1995 and therefore are still less than 10 years, 20 years old. Time flies. This slide says underneath these pictures, why now? Why now? Why introduce RDA? Why make a break with AACR? And the answer is the impact of the global digital environment. Libraries have to deal with a much greater variety of stuff, specifically digital, in terms of its carrier. And the rules for describing such stuff need to be kept up to date and need to be radically changed in some instances to accommodate the various ways that information is now published and made available to users. So things include compact discs, websites, digitized materials, born digital materials, as well as all the old stuff that we deal with in libraries, print-based culture, and audiovisual materials, analog-based audiovisual materials. So RDA attempts to respond to the new needs of the global digital environment. In the short term, I think some of the obvious impacts on users are going to be the things listed here. RDA attempts to use plain English, and I put that in brackets because clearly RDA will also be translated into non-English languages. So RDA attempts to explain the instructions and its other content in easy-to-understand terminology. For example, in catalog records, the prescribed terminology for what used to be sine locum, place not identified in Latin, abbreviated and put in square brackets, thus introducing a triple level of what does this mean in the eye of the user. That has been replaced by the phrase place of publication not identified. It's an attempt to make it obvious to users what the information is trying to convey, and not rely on users having classical educations, for example. So all of these Latin abbreviations have been replaced in RDA. There's more consistency in the terminology. When prescribed phrases are used in descriptive metadata, they tend to follow a very similar pattern and not introduce syntactical variations. English is particularly good at allowing all sorts of different forms of saying the same thing, but RDA attempts to make these as consistent as possible. Not only does this benefit users in their understanding of catalog metadata, but it's also easier to translate for international purposes. There is also more detail and clarity in the controlled vocabularies that RDA offers. There are many more controlled vocabularies than there were in AACR2, and this reflects attempts, particularly in the digital environment, to introduce more consistency and linkability to the metadata. The clarity comes from, again, using expanded phrases. There has been some disagreement about some of these phrases, but there are developments underway in RDA to produce more user-friendly versions of them. So we have computer disk cartridge instead of perhaps mini disk. So it's a generic term for things like mini disks, online resource, etc. Instead of just the general material designation electronic, again enclosed in the ubiquitous square brackets, which doesn't really convey much detail about the general nature of the carrier of this information to the end user. So there's more detail and clarity in these controlled vocabularies. All of those things are things that you will notice appearing in your catalogues in the short term if they haven't appeared already. You will see these stock phrases appearing, and if your library management system supports bespoke indexing, you will also see these terms appearing in indexes and search aids, etc. In the long term, the more profound impact of RDA on the catalogue is going to come from its use of functional requirements for bibliographic records as its underlying conceptual model. Further splits what AACR too used to consider a single record about a single resource, the one-to-one principle. Ferber splits this, abandons the principle, and says that there are 4 aspects in the metadata about a particular resource. And these aspects can be accommodated in separate records. So instead of having one descriptive record for the entire resource, Ferber says it is better to have 4 records which are linked together to cover work, expression, manifestation, and item aspects of the resource. These are often referred to as the WEMI entities. They are defined in Ferber as the products of intellectual or artistic endeavor that are named or described in bibliographic records. In other words, they are what we familiarly call resources, bibliographic resources. And in general, that sequence, work, expression, manifestation, then item, reflect aspects that go from the general and abstract to the specific and concrete. A work is an abstract concept and really is the general thing about the resource, so it covers things like creator and subject. Whereas an item is a concrete, in your hand or on your screen, particular exemplar of the resource as a manifestation. It's quite specific, and if it's real, you can hit people on the head with it. Each of these entities is associated with a user task. Ferber attempts to analyze the contents of a descriptive record in terms of how users use those contents in order to satisfy their own tasks. And the 4 user tasks identified by the Ferber model are find, identify, obtain, and use, often referred to as FISO. The subsequent models, FRAD, and functional requirements of subject authority data do introduce some variation into these user attributes, these user tasks. But generally speaking, the principle remains the same. So this arrangement aids navigation through the complexities of bibliographic relationships. These complexities are not realized at all in works which only exist in one expression, one manifestation, one-off printings of a work that's never translated into a different language or issued in a new edition. But in any other complexity, where translations, new editions, abridgments, serial publications which have successors and predecessors, all of that complexity is handled by the Ferber model and is intended to help users to navigate through to find the actual stuff that they want. So although I'm presenting the WEMI stack, as it's sometimes called, as a hierarchical stack here, it should be understood that the relationships between expressions and manifestations are not strictly hierarchical. You can have many manifestations manifesting one expression, and similarly one manifestation may manifest several expressions. I've left that detail out of this diagram. So typically, these primary relationships in Ferber say that a work is realized through one or more expressions. An expression is embodied in one or more manifestations, and a manifestation is exemplified by one or more items. And as an example, we can consider somebody's Symphony No. 1, say Beethoven. An expression of that might be a recording by a particular orchestra, the London Symphony Orchestra, and it may be manifested or carried on an audio DVD. An item would then be an individual copy of that DVD on the shelf. This model and this navigation trail also works for any other recordings of Symphony No. 1 and the manifestation of those recordings as audio files on discrete carriers such as DVD or CD, and various other electronic carriers. And users can enter this navigation hierarchy at any point to satisfy any of their particular user tasks. Although obviously some user tasks, like find, will generally involve some kind of search or some kind of browse through the stack or entering the stack at any point within it at manifestation, expression or work level. It's quite rare in libraries for items to be given anything searchable other than their barcode, and generally they're not relevant to users' FIS tasks, but are certainly relevant to the obtain tasks, because that is what the user will eventually get. I mentioned earlier that Ferber, as well as allowing navigation between bibliographic records, split into the four elements of Ferber. It also allows navigation through the complex relationships between these entities, between works, between manifestations and expressions. So we can have a situation where work A is derived from work B, or conversely, work B is the source of derivation of work A. And Ferber provides a fairly rich set of high-level relationships to relate these resource entities together. But Ferber also provides rich relationships to relate agents, that's persons, corporate bodies, and families who are responsible for various aspects of works, expressions, manifestations, and items. Those entities, agent entities, can have relationships between them. A person, two people can be related in some way. People can be members of corporate bodies. Families are types of corporate bodies, and so on. And they also are related to the resources themselves, the works, expressions, manifestations, and items, by another set of relators, such as published by. So a manifestation can be published by a particular agent. These are presented in Ferber as quite broad and high-level relationships. What RDA has done is refined those relationships down several layers of granularity to provide an extensive list of roles and other designators, and you will find those in appendices I, J, and K in the RDA toolkit. As I said, in some instances, the relationship designators are 4 layers of hierarchy below these top-level Ferber relationships. And this provides a quite expansive set of rich interconnections between resources, which will help users navigate catalogs. As more and more metadata is brought together from catalogs in larger and larger applications and aggregations such as WorldCat or Europeana, the number of resources that are related to one another, including entities, agent entities, is going to increase, and these navigation aids will become more and more important. So that's just a very, very brief introduction to some of the ways that RDA is going to impact on users. If I now discuss the short-term impact on systems, there is slightly less to say because RDA does not specify any data carrier or format. This is a deliberate attempt to separate the instructions for creating metadata content for bibliographic information from the way that that content is actually recorded in databases or in applications. So RDA, quite specifically, does not specify any encoding formats or the way in which it expects data to be carried. in online applications or indeed offline applications. You will find in RDA, however, copious references to ISBD punctuation. This is in order to provide a bridge back to the content of AACR2 instructions, which do specify the use of ISBD punctuation. Although ISBD punctuation is given in examples in RDA, you will find nothing in RDA that says you must use such punctuation. And indeed other display formats such as the use of color, underlining, fonts, etc. Are perfectly permissible with RDA content. Having said that, we can't have a discontinuous situation. So Mark 21 has added tags that are specific to RDA in order to accommodate as much RDA data and content as Mark 21 is capable of doing. And this is because Mark 21 is the encoding format used in most current library systems, certainly within the Anglo-American community. And we have to find some way of accommodating, in the short term, all of those benefits for users that I've already mentioned. Systems, therefore, in the short term, can expect to have new Mark 21 tags appearing in records, and systems librarians will have to ensure that their systems make those tags visible. Index maps, for example, the replacement of the old general material designation, the content, media and carrier types of RDA, you may want to index those within GMD and SMD indexes, or you may wish to index them separately or indeed ignore them until there are sufficient records containing these terms to justify an index. But at some point those index maps will need to be updated. And of course new fields and new ways of presenting fields means that display layouts may need to be adjusted in order to accommodate this new information as well. The many new controlled terms and vocabularies, a significant feature of RDA, will allow systems, both for public and staff use, to make much more use of pull-down lists for filling in the content. And ideally, to avoid transcription errors, etc., all controlled vocabularies in RDA records should be entered via pull-down lists that you just point and click at. And similarly, the controlled terms can also be displayed in different ways. As I said, they don't have to be the terminology that's used in the record. If your library management system allows you to substitute labels for index terms, then you can display locally user-friendly labels for these terminologies. But as I said, RDA itself, the Joint Steering Committee, is working on developing such user-friendly labels for many of these controlled terms. In the longer term, there's going to be a much, much bigger impact on systems. The WEMI, the 4-part WEMI records reduce duplication. The hierarchy in the previous diagram shows that you don't have to repeat the fact that Beethoven created the first symphony in question, or indeed that it's a musical work. That can be attached to different expressions. You don't have to repeat the expression data, such as the recording dates, who made the recording, etc., of the symphony. And each time that particular recording appears on a different medium, like CD-ROM, CDR, CD, audio DVD, etc. Instead, you just record the new details in the new manifestation record and attach it to the existing expression record. So the promises of a significant reduction in duplication, but this will require new workflows for cataloging. For example, checking to see whether a manifestation record exists before adding an item, or an expression record exists before adding a manifestation, and whether a work record exists before adding an expression. And there are various other aspects of the workflow that will change. The use of these controlled vocabularies does change the balance in the amount of typing and transcription that has to be done. The other main impact on systems, we can see this already, is the introduction of metadata that does not come from traditional library professional sources. Book reviews, cover art, and metadata like that is not part of the metadata usually generated by catalogers in libraries. And in the long term, we are going to see much more of this incorporated into library search aids, partly because it's there, partly because it covers bits that librarians don't normally reach, and mainly because it's going to be cheaper. So RDA attempts to accommodate the mixing of publisher and machine-generated metadata within its instructions and the output of its instructions. And indeed, I see this as an extension of the shared cataloging infrastructure, which really ought to be lauded more than it is. It's a global infrastructure that has grown up and now involves the collaboration of thousands of professional catalogers worldwide, and it's something I think librarians should actually talk more about, because it's been a very, very significant achievement. RDA encourages more of this and is designed for an environment where shared metadata is the norm. Having said all of that, however, nobody can predict the future. We are in times of rapid change. The change is still as rapid today as it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so there is a distinct possibility that the systems that employ RDA data in the future may be something completely different. And in particular, the impact of linked data technologies may change OPACs out of all recognition. I hope RDA is ready for such a change. In the immediate short-term close environment of RDA and the attempts by the Joint Steering Committee to make sure that RDA is consistent and coherent with other changes in bibliographic metadata and resource description include work on alignment and interoperability with MARC 21, some of which I've mentioned already. There is a map between RDA elements and MARC 21 tags, for example. The Joint Steering Committee is in active dialogue with the Review Group for International Standard Bibliographic Description, ISBD, and that has produced an alignment between ISBD elements and RDA. And next year, the Joint Steering Committee hopes to produce a reciprocal alignment between RDA elements and ISBD. And all of this is intended to improve interoperability between data produced by these two different sets of instructions and data stored in various encoding formats. JSC has also been talking for a number of years now with the publishing industry, and specifically aligning RDA where appropriate with the Online Information Exchange Standards, or ONIX, used by the publishing industry. The overlap with RDA mainly lies in the categorization of content and carrier types. And RDA's terms for these types and media types are based directly on a document called the RDA ONIX Framework, which was produced as a result of this collaboration. JSC is now going to revive work on the framework. It's currently in version 1.0, but next year we expect it to go to have significant development to meet some of the changes that have occurred in the 5 years since it was originally created. We are seeing adoption of RDA well beyond the Anglo-American axis. This, of course, is one of the major goals of RDA, is to recognize that the Anglo-American tradition of cataloging isn't the only way of describing the world. Germany was one of the major early adopters of RDA, and as a result has a full member on the Joint Steering Committee and now also on the Committee of Principals that leads RDA development. Other European countries are actively engaged through the European RDA Interest Group, EURIG, and countries around the world are beginning to declare that they will adopt RDA entirely or some local variation of it. So we are approaching a time when the sun will never set on an RDA using country. Countries in the frame include China, Japan, for example, and South America. This is leading to translations of RDA text. So the toolkit currently contains full translations into French and German, and toolkit users can switch between these translations at will. A full translation into Spanish is in the last stages of development and should be available shortly within the toolkit. And we expect translations into other languages to follow suit. I mentioned RDA and linked data. It's the buzz thing at the moment. The RDA elements and vocabularies have been expressed in forms suitable for linked data applications in resource description framework. You can find these forms of RDA vocabularies and elements in the Open Metadata Registry. You can go there directly using a Google search, or you can use this shortcut URL which is on the screen, rdvocab.info, and that will lead you to a list of the RDA vocabularies that are available and their current status. None of the element sets have yet been published, but we hope to rectify that situation early in the new year. Quite a few of the controlled terminology vocabularies have been published in a form suitable for linked data, and you can find those in the Open Metadata Registry as well. So there's already compatibility for this new way of looking at things in RDA, and Joint Steering Committee expects that will be further developed within RDA over the next year or two. And finally, lots of people want to know where they can find out more about the practical application of RDA, and are particularly interested in training resources. You can find some training resources listed on the RDA toolkit and in various other places on the World Wide Web. The CILIP British Library Committee on RDA, who are your local representatives and through whom you can influence the development of RDA, has a website, and that's the URL given on this screen. And it has a section on training resources, and we've attempted to list all of the extant training resources that are available. Not all of them are in English, but between the stuff listed on this page, you can find quite a lot of self-teaching materials, cheat sheets, checklist guides, etc., to get you started on using RDA in your library. The website contains other information about the CILIP BL Committee on RDA as well, so I encourage you to have a look at all of that if you're not familiar with it already. And that's it. Time for questions.
That was great, Gordon. Thank you very much. If you have any questions for Gordon, you can just type them into the chat box. Everyone's shy. I did ask a question of the participants about whether or not LMS suppliers had created any kind of help or assistance with institutions turning on RDA, and Sheila up in RGU was very helpful to say that Circe have a mark update script that they use, and Igor at NHS Education has said that RDA and LMS usual means just usual implementation of new mark tags. So
yes, I agree with Igor's comment there. At this stage, I think it's fair to say, and I don't have any detailed information about what particular vendors are doing, and I myself do not work in a library any longer, so I don't even have first-hand experience of what it's like on the ground. Yes, at the moment, because RDA is being shoehorned into Mark 21, and most systems, librarians and vendors are familiar with manipulating Mark 21 tags for local OPACs, etc. It's likely to change in the future. We know, for example, that the Library of Congress is seeking a successor to Mark 21 in the BibFrame project, which they stated will be linked to data, by the way. And so the ability of RDA to be expressed in linked data is highly significant to these initiatives. Once linked data applications come along, and it's not a case of if, in my opinion, but when, although it's a very big move to make. When we see linked data applications start to come along, and not necessarily from within the library world, we may then start to see significant shifts in the way that systems are engineered and structured, and in their ability to accommodate the full richness of RDA and its intended utility. So in the short term, yes, it's a familiarity with Mark 21 that's required, but I think we should all expect radical changes in the medium to long term.
Thanks, Gordon. Jill at Manchester Met is asking, how future-proof is the RDA in handling, for example, new media?
It's about as future-proof as possible. This would come under extensions to the RDA Onyx framework. And as I said earlier, our Joint Steering Committee is setting up a group to further the development of the framework. The framework was very, very carefully constructed it basically consists of an ontology of finer-grained attributes, which together, when aggregated, form meaningful concepts at the user level. So, for example, tactile music is an aggregation of two attributes, one of which is called character, which is given the value music, and the other attribute is the sensory perception that is intended to be used to access the content. In this instance, Braille, for example, is intended to be used by touch. And so we get terms like tactile music, which is just a synonym for Braille. But underneath that is this ontology, and that ontology is broad enough to accommodate any new media type that might evolve that the framework group could think of at the time. This was about 5 years ago. I have to say that the only new media type that the group thought of that was not accommodated in the framework is direct injection into the brain of the user of the data. In other words, this cyberpunk jacking idea that you can somehow get the user's brain to interact with data rather than going through any kind of intermediation such as a computer system. Now, this is science fiction. And so, RDA currently is not of a mind to accommodate science fiction ideas for the future. But short of that, I am very confident indeed that RDA is future-proof for any type of new media that may come along.
Brilliant. Cheers, Gordon. Igor from NHS Education Scotland is asking if you know of any good examples of Ferberized catalogue yet.
The short answer is no. There was some experimentation work done by OCLC 3 or 4 years back, which resulted in an experimental application called Fiction Finder, which was Ferberized as much as OCLC could do Ferberization on the data that they have in WorldCat. Now that data is mainly Mark 21 based, and Mark 21 is not a Ferberized encoding scheme. And attempts to derive Ferberized records from Mark 21 records have generally been unsuccessful below the expression level. And I have to say that quite a lot of that lack of success is due to the quality of the data rather than the actual structure of the data. So at the moment, the existing legacy metadata cannot be fully Ferberized. Several other organizations have tried to do it. But Fiction Finder at least showed how Ferber can assist navigation. So instead of having page after page of titles saying the same thing for a popular work of fiction, I'll use Moby Dick because it's been used in other research areas. So a popular book like Moby Dick that's been produced in multiple editions since it was published in multiple translations on multiple carrier formats. In a large aggregated catalogue, such as Fiction Finder, you only see the title Moby Dick once, and you can drill through that title to the various translations, editions, etc., and then drill through those into the manifestations and finally into the holdings. So it's an example of Ferberization. I am not entirely certain whether it's still available, however, for people to look at. Ferberization, I have to say, has mainly occurred in areas that are not traditionally associated with OPACs. The linking open vocabularies registry of the link to data vocabularies, LOV, which is a good source of vocabularies, not just bibliographic, but all kinds of terms that have been created for linked data. It actually organizes its records using Ferber. It says that the vocabulary itself is a work, that various versions of the vocabulary issued over the years are expressions of that work. The availability of the vocabulary online or as a downloadable dump or in various formats like RDF XML or terse triple language, they're all manifestations, and particular copies are items. It's fully Ferberized, fully realized, but it's not a service that's intended for use by end users. So at the moment what we're seeing is Ferberization occurring in small pockets where there are no legacy issues, where people are basically building up their catalogs from scratch, and sadly where the data is not really reusable by other services. Although obviously it's made available as open link data, it's highly unlikely that people would want to take the LOV records, for example, as Ferber records and put them into a separate Ferber system. So within the library world, we have a chicken and egg situation where enormous investment is required by the vendors to Ferberize the infrastructure, but there's no critical mass of Ferberized records for them to work on and justify the work at this time. So we have to wait until a balance is achieved where the pressure to release the value of RDA records exceeds the pressure to keep costs down. And that's an issue for the vendors and library managers and funders.
Great, Gordon. We're running out of time a little bit here, so I'll make this the last comment, and it's from Nikki Clack from Durham University. She's saying, I'm seeing a lot of hybrid AACR2 RDA records, and she wonders how are other libraries dealing with these. Before Gordon answers, Nikki, I can send you details of a library system in Scotland that are doing that very thing, so I'll send you that information offline, but over to Gordon.
It's an issue. The particular case issue that I've come across is with these media content and carrier types which replace the GMDs. Libraries are now faced with GMD indexes and whether they make them hybrid by including these new RDA terms, as I said earlier, or whether they exclude them until they are sufficient to justify, and at some point the GMD index gets switched off. I have no idea how different libraries are dealing with it. I know, for example, the National Library of Scotland is beginning to discuss the issue because they're beginning to receive RDA records. So the best suggestion I have is to use LIS UK BIBS, that's LIS-UK-BIBS, which is the main list for discussion about standards used in the UK, including RDA. I think we should see more activity on that list because I think lots of libraries are facing similar questions. Some libraries may have come up with resolutions and you should all talk a bit more about them. There are other ways of also asking questions. You could try LIS CIGS, which tends to have quite a lot of Scottish members, or there's LIS Link, for example. So I urge you to take, to ask these questions and any other questions that may come up from this seminar on those lists and see what answers you get.
Excellent, Gordon. As usual, fantastic. So I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Gordon Dunsire for presenting on RDA today, and actually just to thank the participants as well for engaging with the webinar. So that's really the end of the session. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.